Welcome to episode 107 of the Lowdown Radio Show presented by advrider.com. I'm Neil Graham. This week I speak to Michael Hopkins, president of an industrial design firm with long-standing ties to Harley-Davidson in the brand's formative years. Hopkins also worked at Harley for nearly 16 years, and our conversation stretches from the design of the Coke bottle to Willie G. Davidson's Hail Mary that dragged Harley out of the doldrums 50 years ago. And, well, couldn't the brand use another miracle like that right about now? Like a lightweight introductory machine to bring new blood into the brand like the street model was supposed to do, but failed? Well, and wouldn't you know it, Hopkins worked on the street project when he was at Harley. And what did he learn from the experience? Well, you'll have to listen to get the goods. We also talked planned obsolescence. The founder of his company is heavily associated with the term. And did you know that rival manufacturers colluded to ensure that light bulbs died an early death? Yes, this and more on this week's Lowdown Radio Show. So there was a man named Brooks Stevens, not just the company that you are the president of and a co-owner of, but tell me, who was he as a man?
Brooks Stevens. He's a very fascinating man. He self-classified as a businessman, an engineer, and a designer, but really he's best known for being really one of the pioneers of the industrial design profession and making, bringing design to the boardroom as a key competitive advantage that businesses had to grow and create just, products that users loved before like what we know it is today.
Because this is 1934, I believe the company started, correct?
It is, yeah. We started in 1934, and it really started as maybe more of like an advertising function, right? Like using design to specifically take industrialized products targeted towards a user, right? You had a changing kind of demographic happening in the U.S., and the purchase decision was changing of how things were being brought into homes. And so he was one of the first to realize that, if you design, say, to a housewife or, a family who might have different needs than were traditionally, pushed upon them, you could really stand out and your product could win. And if you look at his product portfolio, there are just a number of firsts. And it's just, it's consistent over his whole career.
Can you give me an example maybe of one thing that sort of is emblematic of what he believed in?
Yeah, a few of them really stand out. One that always resonates with me is, putting a window in a clothes dryer seems very, very obvious, but he was the first to do it.
Really? Oh, that's interesting.
You had this industrial product, like people used to send their laundry out, or maybe they, some of the wealthier families had, service in the house that would do the laundry. But now when that started to change and you had more of this appliance era, you had to kind of prove that it was actually doing something, and seeing the clothes tumble was actually like a key value feature. And it seems so obvious now, but like it clearly wasn't in at the time. And it really is one of those examples of a key differentiator that you just take for granted.
I feel that he's responsible for a lot of wasted hours of my youth, because I think I would sit in the basement when it was too hot in the house. I'd sit in the basement and watch the laundry spin, which was kind of fascinating. And what sort of era did he introduce that?
That would have been pretty early on, right? Like, so that would have been, I would say, when, they're obviously starting in the 30s, you have this wartime era where, a lot was focused on supporting wartime efforts. So I would say, right into that baby boom era of, the 50s and into the 60s was really like kind of the hot time to start applying these methods and perfecting them.
Now, he was also associated with something which we tend to think of now as very controversial, which is the notion of planned obsolescence. And I've got a quote here. And this is what he said, Brooks Stevens said, quote, "Instilling in the buyer the desire to own something a little newer, a little better, a little sooner than is necessary." Now, there's a lot of pushback. Planned obsolescence is like taxes. Everybody, it kind of rolls their eyes. Now, he, and I'm guessing you, don't necessarily think of that as negative. And there's kind of, and correct me if I'm incorrect here, but there's kind of two streams of planned obsolescence. One is a mechanical, driven by something that fails, and the other is driven by the desire for the new. Is that true?
That is true. Yeah, I think this is where history and things change over time, which changes interpretation of what was meant. And you're right, the latter of this desire that people have, right? You get used to something, and then you start to discover its usefulness, and you start to require new features, right? It starts to evolve, and as a product developer, you're always thinking about that value prop, like what is it accomplishing? What is the useful life of it? And you're always trying to be ahead of it. So it's not, meant to imply that we're trying to replace perfectly good products sooner, but it is that point of understanding that like the user themselves is actually demanding more out of the product, and you need to be in tune to that. And it's challenging because like now you look at it, if you think of sustainability as being like a main driver in a lot of industrial designers' work, the concept sounds counter to that. But the behavior that you see, people avoiding even the term planned obsolescence, we still have model years of cars. Like, how does that make sense, right?
Because
Cars
that
change year over year.
that was a human invention. Because I mean, I remember reading that when the notion of a 1916 Ford and a 1917 Ford was introduced. But it's so much a part of just, I never thought that there could be such a thing, that it never existed. But it didn't exist. You just bought a car.
Correct.
But
And when we look at it historically, like, we have these, let's call them seasons of cars, right? Like you have a Gen 1 that turns into a Gen 2, and there's this year over year span, but it's, do you have the 1964? Do you have this 1965 or this,
yeah,
66? Generally the same car and like little tweaks, but it's not that each model year is actually a different car. But it is this silent planned obsolescence that these companies still work in, even though the term has kind of morphed a bit over time.
but there also is the notion of, and I remember, well, just in preparation for our conversation, I was reading about light bulb manufacturers at one point got together and decided that their light bulbs were lasting too long. And so this consortium of all these 5 or 6 companies, including General Electric was one of them, got together and cut the life of a light bulb from 1,500 hours to 1,000 hours. Now, I guess now we would call that collusion, or market fixing or something like that. But there is a mechanical side where you just don't. I mean, part of this is wanting to sell more stuff, isn't it? I mean, that's ultimately at the root of it, is it not?
I mean, yeah, I want to be careful with interpretation. I've never in my career either been led or taught to design something to a planned failure mode.
Right.
Not once. It's not in any requirements. It's usually the opposite. It's, hey, it needs to last a lot longer, right? Like when we talk about vehicle design, there might be mileage targets, there may be service life targets, and it's usually the opposite. How do we extend the life, not predict when something is going to fail sooner? I think it's just a very big misnomer, and I think it's your example is probably a very small exception to most products, because I don't think as good as people are, I don't think we're actually that talented to pinpoint that point of saying, yeah, we're going to make this fail in 3 months so that we could sell more. It's just I don't think that's a very great business to begin with.
You've written that industrial design is an American phenomenon. Now, it was taken over by other countries. Now, and I've heard this before. So walk us through that argument that industrial design is an American thing.
Yeah, this is a pretty hot take, and it gets a lot of attention globally because obviously outside of America, people also practice industrial design, and there's a lot of history of where it's been influenced. You know, dating very very early. Industrial design in general is very very misunderstood. I tend to think it's one of the most misunderstood professions. I'm a classic example of that. I've always wanted to be a designer my whole life, but through high school, I was advised to be an engineer. Uh,
And we're gonna get into that in a little bit when
so
you ended up at Harley-Davidson. But yeah, this notion of industrial design, it is invisible, isn't it?
it is a bit invisible,
Yeah.
and what I mean by it was invented, in America is that it's really the application. I mean, there is influence globally before it was really practiced in the US, right? Like, relatively speaking, the US is a very young country, and but what I'm really referring to is the commercialization, right? Like, this perfection of bringing design into the factories. America was really where that started. Like, it was influenced from England and Germany, but, fairly abandoned, right? Like, it wasn't really executed to its full potential until it really proliferated through the US, and there's a lot of reasons for that, right? Like, we're talking about the timing earlier, like, the pre and post-war phenomenon of what set that up is an important, like, catalyst, but, that's what I'm really referring to is how the US really took it and, you know, scaled it.
Well, when I think of industrial design, I think of the sort of the formative years of it in the U.S. I think of General Motors, who took their styling department, integrated their styling department into the sort of, and I'm going to get the language wrong here, but integrated it into the design of vehicles, and it wasn't just something that was tacked on at the end. And I also think of the great American designer Raymond Loewy, who seemingly designed just about everything. Tell me about if you're familiar with the General Motors experience, and certainly you are with Raymond Loewy.
Yeah, certainly, 'cause, Raymond and Brooks competed quite a bit. Like, one of the most storied was, Brooks had taken over some of the design work at Studebaker, which obviously,
Ah,
Raymond Loewy had designed a lot of the earlier ones. He designed the Avanti, and,
yeah.
Brooks was brought in to help save the company on that side. But my position on where industrial design fits in this and why it worked in those eras was the design had the ear all the way to the top. Like, you're talking about small groups of executives that are making decisions that are design driven, but with business results as the focus. And my thesis on this comment of, "Hey, it was built here," is based on we've lost a lot of that today. It has become closer to how you described it, where it's become a styling function. Like, "Oh, we're just trying to make it look good." And what the magic was in that time frame and in that era that you're referring to was that it was actually a business function. Like, the purpose of it was the outcome of growth and revenue and profitability all the way through the manufacturing process. And I think that's often misunderstood. Like, industrial designers are very talented at designing for manufacturability.
Right.
So it's not just what it looks like, but it's how it's gonna be made and how it's gonna be made at scale, which is actually what's important for a company like GM and among, all the products that we consume, is that you can actually make it and still have a business.
Well, I think, before we leave Raymond Loewy, I mean, the Coke bottle is, I think, one of those things that, is so synonymous with the product that you can't think of them being separated. I mean, now I know you get it in cans, but I guess I'm a traditionalist. But it still tastes better out of a bottle. We all know that. But that was one of those things. And maybe talk about like the Coke bottle and from a consumer's perspective, what does it mean to have something in such an identifiable container that has a very tactile sense because you hold in your hand? Um, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, it's really interesting whether it's that or a number of other products where, having that experience that you get, that you described, right? Whether it was like the feel in your hand or the temperature because it's a glass bottle and it's a cold Coca-Cola, or that feeling when it hits your lips, right? It's creating this memory, right? And, the first time you do it, it's like that first experience. And maybe it's, the repeated, yeah, now I'm tied to that. And now I'm centered on that brand. And now I can identify it and I can see the silhouette and I know that's what I want. And it brings this emotional response. And yeah, Raymond and among others, Teague and obviously Brooks, they were all very, very talented in just being able to find those little elements that would, bring a bit of joy to the consumption, whether it's the actual consumption, like of Coca-Cola, or
Right.
purchase, that initiated, that, kickoff of the experience. So, yeah, the Coke bottle is a great one because it even though there's been variations and it's gone from say glass to plastic, it's still unmistakable, right? Like that silhouette, and it really can't be copied. Um, as much as people try to emulate or push the boundaries a little bit, it's not uh, trademark protection or patent protection that saves it. It's really brand, right? Like the brand that it builds from that experience is what's actually what Raymond created in that, that's created this like longevity for Coca-Cola.
And if that's one of the best examples of American industrial design, certainly one of the most famous. Um, and you sort of alluded to this earlier. There's been a long fallow period. You feel, I think, in industrial design, and and you talk about this, and you've written about this. Both the Germans and the Japanese, especially in vehicle design, motorcycle design, really sort of took over, didn't they? That idea.
They did, particularly from the sense of how we educate, how we build the talent. They really leveraged what we had learned over those decades that we were just talking through, and then valued it in a way where they applied it all the way through the design. And if you recall, like just our transition in the U.S. from that era we're referring to cost competitiveness globally. You talk about eras of offshoring and just consolidation of brands and the acquisitions that happened, um, sort of like a bit of distraction from what was important in the business, to kind of like bottom line. And a number of those companies, including like the Koreans, are doing a great job of that too. You look at these cars and the appreciation that they have for how important some of the design language is and how consistent it is across the platform, um, demonstrates that they really understand that value. And they're able to do it at all price points, which is even more interesting.
Which is, and I think you have a better sense of that and how difficult that is than most of us. Which is that it's one thing to make a 911, but it's something else to make an economy car have that identifiable character, isn't it?
It is. It can be really challenging, but like I like to put it like the work is the work. And so if you're going to do it, you have to do it with intent. And typically you have to bake that in early, because coming back to it later becomes cost prohibitive to make those changes. So it really has to be right from the point of planning the project. You have to have design intent in the room.
Do you still think there's, because you've written about this idea that, and I'm gonna botch your beautifully worded example, so forgive me, but you talk about in designing a product, if there's a problem with it and you catch it before it's gone to production, it costs $10 to fix it, and then you go through all the steps. Each successive step, it gets more important or more expensive to fix it, and then if it makes it to the consumer and it's got something wrong with it, well, it's astronomically expensive because it's a recall. So, do companies still, and I'm talking major companies, do they still misunderstand what industrial design is? Do you see these mistakes still happening in the
I
production of
do.
objects today?
I do. Unfortunately, as I was mentioning before, I feel like industrial design continues to be one of the most misunderstood professions. It's also morphed a lot. So people who may have traditionally practiced industrial design started taking on other roles that weren't as clear, as well as organizations were designed in a way where um, they may have gained more access to the C-suite, like they might have titles like chief design officer, but then the stylists themselves or the industrial designers get put off into like a creative room or even uh, a remote location where they can be creative.
The coast
And I
of
think,
California, usually.
yeah, I think that created a bit of a gap in some respects because they're not right next to the engineers. And so when things, where I see that it happen the most is when you have a culture where a company is predominantly engineering driven, particularly in the US, that's really, really common. um, they tend to have the veto power. And so that's really where it falls apart of where it's the value gap isn't really understood. The role isn't understood. And it feels like, oh, you're just, it's just the look. It really has to function. This is the argument of form follows function. It's like you still need both, right? And they need to work in harmony, not, in compromise. So you're hitting on it that it's the lack of understanding of what the skills are and how they're applied and the continuity that design has to have and the accountability that the teams need to have back to design in order to have a successful product at the end. It's a bit disconnected in that stream, right? Because a lot of that input is coming in early or it's missed and you don't actually see the results until the end when the consumer is using it. And so it can be very logical to just move on and by the time you discover it, it's way too late.
Well, let's talk about an example of that. You've written about when Willie G. Davidson joined the company. Of course, there's only one company in Milwaukee, which is Harley-Davidson, in 1963, and how he sort of brought them out of the malaise of the American Machine and Foundry, the AMF years. Tell me that story.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, Willie got his initial experience working with Brooks Stevens, right? Like he's an alum of the firm and
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah, yeah. And that's part of what's really interesting about that legacy is that, he learned from Brooks who had designed motorcycles for Harley, since the 40s. And yeah, when Willie, went to the company and decided to, start this styling studio, he had this logic built in. And I think that's what's missed because, you know Willie G. Davidson as, grandson of the founder uh, of one of the founders of Harley Davidson, but really his skill in that boardroom, with his peers, his leadership peers that are, let's call it designing by committee and having this power to understand the value of that design to the business and how, it's more than a motorcycle, right? Like it's the personal freedom that this vehicle gives and that experience, like the Coke bottle we described, right? He understood that this vehicle is much more than a piece of transportation, or it certainly, like when he joined in the 60s, wasn't this piece of jewelry yet, right? Like it was, but he realized that was going to be an advantage for them, particularly against their competitors who were, beating them on engineering and quality and all of the other things, right? Like how are we going to compete? And yeah, it was really important. And it wasn't just him though, right? Like he ended up in the 70s bringing Louis Netz in, who also is a Brooks alum. And between the two of them, they really solidified what the styling studio meant to Harley Davidson and really got built into the product development process. And so it was yeah, it was a great example of just how to do it right, like all the way from the business and have a voice at the table that wasn't just, oh, we're just making it look like a beautiful machine.
But are there specifics? I mean, the one that's always trotted out is that Willie G would sort of hang around with enthusiasts, and let's face it, had his surname not been Davidson, he probably wouldn't have been listened to either. Truthfully, would he?
I mean, yeah, his ability to leverage his name was
And his capability,
and his
naturally.
capability. Yeah, I think what's important in that is, it's easy to look at Harley and look at it in retrospect because you look at the experience you get through the rallies and like through the community and kind of the personas that have come out. But let's go back. That didn't exist in that
Right.
capacity at that point. Like, in fact, motorcycles, particularly Harleys at that point, were pretty rebellious. And like, do you really want to be part of that group? And like, I don't know if I want to be associated, right? Like the friendliest people you'll meet are riding a Honda. Like there was a big point of differentiation there. I think the key is that skill you just hit on, where he went to the customer and learned from them and lived with them. And that's a leading indicator of a good designer, of that empathy, of understanding who these personas are and what those elements that they value are, because it's not always the obvious. It's not the shiny, objects, the great paint and the chrome, right? It is the ride, it is the experience, it is, the community. And by him understanding that, he was able to really execute it despite the name, right, as being the advantage. It wasn't his sole calling card, right? Like it was actually the execution of translating what he understood from this consumer, uh, and really, I don't think he interpreted them as that, right? Like he interpreted as, we have this community who deserves something better, and we're going to deliver it.
And simply put, I think in this was the introduction of sort of the bikes like the Super Glide and the Wide Glide, and they're essentially factory customs, weren't they? Because he was looking at what people were doing with their bikes, and chopping them and turning them into bobbers and choppers and everything else, and incorporating elements of that into a factory made motorcycle, an OEM motorcycle, which now we think nothing of, but at the time that didn't happen, did it?
It didn't. No, you got what was sold to you, right? And there's a number of industries that are still in that, right? Here's the list of options you can have, but yeah, that discovery that you talked about was critical in that. And then when you pair it with that era of coming out of the AMF years, where there was really this like mass industrialization part of it, which was partially right. Like if we're going to compete, we have to do it at scale. We have to do it repeatably, reliably, because they clearly weren't in that era. They started to bring in the other pieces of the puzzle, right? They started to bring in some of the automotive leadership that understood some of those factors to help build out, like, their whole manufacturing changed shortly after that. So not only could you design a great motorcycle, but you could actually produce it repeatedly in a way that was serviceable and, as you said, like, something that people could personalize, relatively easily.
Well, everyone knows that Harley-Davidson these days is in a bit of a funk, and everyone who rides a motorcycle, seems to have an opinion
Yeah.
on what they should do, and I've heard just about, and I've had a fair number of my own opinions that are just as bizarre as everyone else's. Um, what do you think Harley should do? And I mean, just to background this question, I guess, the sales are way down, and they're being tied with this baby boomer generation that is, of course, no longer riding motorcycles, in many cases, and they're aging out, and successive generations are not adopting, are not becoming Milwaukee faithful like the previous generations were. The heady days of the 90s seemed like they would never end, and yet they seem to have ended. So what does Harley have to do as a business model, in your view, to get back on its feet?
Yeah, I appreciate it's interesting when I posted about this, it was very hard for me to do. I have an emotional tie to the brand, right? From my
Well, you worked there for almost 16 years, and we're gonna talk about that next. So
Yeah,
so
so
speak to me as an enthusiast and as a business person.
yeah, so when I look at it, I have, like a lot of people who have opinions, everybody wants to see Harley succeed. So, the ideas are everywhere, and one thing I notice with a lot of the ideas, it's kind of focused on complaining about what they're doing, and I can't blame Harley for what they're doing at all. Like if you look at their product portfolio, it completely makes sense. Like it's very logical. They're making high quality product that is being sold. It's what's missing. And why and how do you do that? So this is more, my opinion on it is more driven by just general product development experience of like, how do you, like, if you're trying to grow your business, how do you, meet your niche that you're trying to hit, which I would argue they are. It's just that niche might be shrinking a bit. Um, but also, how do you extend the life cycle that you have with your customer? Like, when does that start? And I think that's where some of the opportunity for Harley is right now, is that, they have a pretty tight window of who their customer profile is, it appears. And um, the immediate task at hand is, how do we grow that, right? The obvious is, how does it get younger, right? What types of products might do that? And I think what's interesting about it is that um, it it may emulate things that they've done in the past, where it could be partnerships with other brands. It could be experience based, where the brand starts to solidify. It could be their Coca-Cola bottle moment, where it's like, I've put some type of seed in where now people have an affinity to the brand. And there's elements of that working through their recent history, let's say the last 30 or 40 years. It's the continuity that has been a little bit challenging with, okay, what happened to these product platforms or these relationships that may have been reprioritized and lost, that need to be rebuilt.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to pin you down. You're speaking in lots of designery terms. What should they build? Should they build small capacity motorcycles, or should they form? You talked about relationships with other brands, Ermaki, the '60s, which they did in the '60s, the Italian brand, which made their lightweight motorcycles, the Sprint, and so on. Is that what you're speaking of?
Uh, yeah, I think it's important if motorcycles themselves are what are important and that's their niche. Then yeah, there is definitely trends happening in the two-wheel world right now, and they're not participating really at all. And many companies aren't participating. So it's not just an opportunity for Harley Davidson, it's actually an opportunity for all. And none of us can miss all of the press of, you know, adolescent and young teenage kids doing wheelies through all our neighborhoods on e-motorcycles, right? Like, they started as e-bikes, and we all
Yeah,
know what
yeah.
they are. They're throttle motorcycles, right? They just happen to have e-power, and they're everywhere. And as somebody who has two teenage boys, like, they ride them and desire to have them. And
Well,
all of us.
I'm guessing that you're sorry to jump in here, but your boys would rather have the latest Sur-on than they would a Harley Davidson.
And that's just because I think it doesn't exist. There's no real brand affinity there that would pull them to a Harley Davidson. It's
Right.
more of what I recall from when I was a teenager and I got into motorcycling. It was just about that experience of being on two wheels, and like, what was affordable and what was fun and what could I learn on. But like a lot of people, I bought my second motorcycle really quickly, and then I bought my third, and then I was into other ones, and then I got exposed to Harleys, and I love those. And um, it's interesting. Like, I think I would predict that history will continue to repeat itself. That once you're exposed to two wheels, you will likely always be on two wheels. It doesn't mean you won't buy cars, but I really do believe that this demographic will be on two wheels for the rest of their lives.
So why has Harley always done, and this is a personal opinion, but in my view, Harley's always done a really shitty job with lightweight motorcycles. If you look at other legacy brands, Royal Enfield, for instance, they've always had small bikes, and now they're starting to make bigger bikes. But there's a through line. And Triumph with those 400s that look like real Triumphs. They don't look like something odd. But it seems like Harley Davidson they've just never had it within them to really have any enthusiasm for small motorcycles. That's how I picture
Yeah.
it. Do you think that's right?
You're definitely getting a good read. I think one of the burdens they have is that they're really an ultra premium vehicle, not just motorcycle, but like, let's just look at what it is, right? Like, if we look at the average price point of what sells and what sells at volume, it's a highly premium vehicle.
Yeah.
And the burden I'm referring to is that you have a certain brand identity that you have to live up to. And intuition says, well, if I did a Harley Davidson version of a Sur-on, that would dilute the brand. And there's some reality to that, right? Like, it very well could be, if that's the perspective you have. Is that going to take away from, your 40,000 $50,000 CVO model. My argument is that this is something that they do have a right to win, and it's figure outable, right? Like if you put the right constraints about it, it's really framing it of, well, what would a Harley Davidson in that? It's probably not a $25,000 EV motorcycle that a teenager is going to buy. Like it's just that's too big of a gap there. It's you know yeah, what's the most premium that would compete with this Suron? What's that gap, and how would Harley come to the market to meet that? And I think that's a solvable thing. And I think my peers, who are maybe in the motor company might argue with me to say, no, it's impossible. But I think when, from our business, when we're looking at not just, the motorcycle market or the automotive market, we're in all sorts of industries. We start to see where it's working in other industries where it's like, wow, they figured something out here. Can we apply that over here? And I do think there's ways to do this.
You started at Harley-Davidson. In fact, you worked almost 16 years for the motor company. So you've done your time. What was your first experience? Because you went in as an engineer. You were not an industrial designer at the time. And then you had one of those, oh shit moments. I think I ruined my life, and you changed it. So take me through that. Tell me that story.
Yeah, it's really wild. I was one of these kids growing up who was always sketching. Could draw really well, really good at math and science. And you get this advice. You're like, oh, yeah, like you should be an engineer. You want to design things. And so I didn't know any better. I went to a really great engineering school in Milwaukee School of Engineering, and exited with a degree. And I had two pathways in front of me. I was going to be an aerodynamicist in Formula One, which is really popular now. And my kids are like, how did you not do that? Or go to Harley Davidson, which was like a dream, right? Like, because here's this local hero in the late 90s, and I have an awesome opportunity.
Yeah.
So that was the most logical path for me. And so I took it. And like my first week at Harley, I'm touring around as you do, right? You see all the labs and you see some manufacturing. And I get, toured around the styling studio, which was kind of I don't think it was locked at that point, but it was clearly like special to be in there. And I just felt at home. You look there and you're like, this is what I want to do. And,
and then they led you out to your desk in another part of the building, and you thought, well, I want to go back there.
Yeah. And so, as you do, this was a point of a lot of hiring. Like you make friends at work, and there's other, peers my age that are in that studio, and I'm making friends with them. And they're explaining to me that this is a completely different, profession with a whole different degree path. I seriously considered, I'm like, I should just go back to school and like get this. But, that also wasn't the right path either. But it was at that moment where I really had that epiphany that I'm going to be an advocate for industrial design because it is misunderstood. Like, yeah, it's not that it's too late for me to be a practitioner, but like if I'm misunderstanding it, that means a whole lot of other people are misunderstanding it too. But where it led me was really positive, because what I figured out is industrial design is also just one component of a bigger machine, which is product development. And so it's all of the players, and that's really where I leaned in was understanding the full spectrum of product development, everything from the early business planning to the industrial design, to the engineering, to the supply base, manufacturing, right? Life cycle management of eventually products have to sunset. And then you realize like, okay, there's peace and harmony here of understanding all of this, and then being an advocate for some of these skills that support it.
Michael Hopkins, who's an industrial designer and ex of Yamaha and Aprilia, he's been on the podcast a number of times. We've spoken about Harley-Davidson in the glory years, where their profit on a motorcycle was in the 20s and even approaching 30%, which is unheard of in the motorcycle industry, which normally is in the single digits in terms of profitability. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that this kind of ties in with my belief in that a motorcycle. Now, you worked on the Street 500 and 750 projects. Now, these were not successful motorcycles. Now, Michael has told me that he talked to some of the companies who did some of the work on the Street in terms of braking, suspension, and some of the chassis engineering. And And essentially, it was Harley-Davidson trying to make an inexpensive motorcycle with the profit margins of a more expensive motorcycle. And that essentially, Michael referred to it as an overpowered Bajaj Pulsar competitor.
Mm.
Now, you were inside of that. So tell me what happened with the street?
That's interesting, and if we reflect on where it is, I spent a few years in India working on that bike. It's a very interesting program. I came in at a maybe midpoint of that program. I don't want to call it a point where it was intended to save. That would be a bit inaccurate, but it was really get it across the finish line. It had its challenges because we were entering a world where the cost targets were really important, and it really starts with that. Like, you only get profitability if you can actually hit your cost targets. But what was actually the bigger focus was that this was meant to be a global motorcycle. It was meant to be produced both in the US and um, outside the US in a way that it could be the same motorcycle for the whole world. And it was successful at that. Like, we built two identical uh, production lines, one in Boal, India, and one in Kansas City, Missouri, and they were both great. Like, the quality of product that came out of both of those was fantastic. I think what it, I think what the product, if we call it a failure, which likely I would agree with, because it's no longer in existence. And I think of like platforms that exist for decades is actually what the target was. Um,
Well, kind of the new Sportster, I guess, was kind of the hope, was it not?
yeah, I think where the the idea of the street platform was to be that entry point to the brand, right? So if we can get people at a price point that they discover what a Harley Davidson is, then there is this potential, right, and hope that people will enter a Dyna or a Softail at that time, right? And then if they're on that, then they'll definitely move into a bigger bike, because we saw that progression.
Yeah.
So I don't know that the truth was actually that it was trying to be as profitable as it was pretty well understood, even with other platforms like the V-Rod and even the Sportster, that there was some different expectations based on what it was, but it definitely had a customer life cycle expectation that maybe was you know creating demand more than really understood uh, what the demand was, and entered a competitive arena that there was a lot of product to compete against.
So knowing what you know now, having been through that, and having now you're of course a bigwig with Brooks Stevens, um, had Harley Davidson come to you or any other company with that project um, in the beginning, what would you have done differently, or how would you have approached it in a way that the motor company didn't approach it?
Um,
There's a lot of hypotheticals here, I know,
there
but
is a lot of hypotheticals, and being careful of knowing all the inside stories versus what the reality was. We actually did it. I think that um, if I could pivot the actual example, I
I know you don't want to piss your friends off across town. I
it's
understand.
actually not even that. It's that this is also Brooks' philosophy a bit of like, every program has things you could do better. And so I probably wouldn't do that program again. It would be, what would I do differently on the
Right.
next one? I think that's really the root of the question.
Okay, well, yeah,
We
maybe
did
take
that.
that.
So what
Yeah.
we did is, out of that program, what we did is we took our whole product development methodology and refocused it to answer exactly what you asked, like, how could we do it better? And it really incorporated a lot more diversity of the product development community within our company to have a voice, because it was who is actually driving the ship and who's in control of this, but who also has to approve these things. And I'm not suggesting that that was the fault of that program, but there was a level of discipline that was required in order to improve the speed to market. Because similar to the examples I was talking about before, some of the early decisions became late results. And so we needed to do a better job up front of being really clear of what the business was and what was in and what was out. And we did that on the new Softail platform, where it was we took the learnings from that and other programs and rolled it into a new methodology that we applied so that we could have more of a like holistic platform approach that was modular, that we could say, how would we do 17 models out of one platform?
Right.
And that was really critical in the difference of, versus like, hey, we need a low cost global bike, get it out. And it was just like, okay, problem, fix, 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 get it
Right.
out. So just having that discipline to process was actually a really big key in how we made improvements going from that program to others.
Harley-Davidson is a company that and I know you don't speak for the company, you don't even work for them. So I'm just asking you as an expert in this sort of stuff and as an enthusiast and as someone who's in Milwaukee. So it's in the air and the water. But I kind of feel sorry for them because, like every time, it seems to me like every time they try anything slightly different. Now, I think the V-Rod, I think had one of the great engines in any motorcycle I've ever ridden. And I've ridden hundreds and hundreds of motorcycles from every imaginable brand. Now, the whole kickback dragster chassis thing never worked for me, but as an engine, it was exquisite. Um, and all these whenever they stray from that very narrow, that looks like a 1952 panhead, whenever they get away from that, they always seem to take a shellacking in the marketplace. Now compare that with, say, Ducati, other legacy brands. Ducati has the new Superleggera, which is all, carbon fiber this there's a traditional company, a legacy brand, as they say, whose customers have allowed them to change into different things. They went from, V-twins to V4s. They made that leap. And yet Harley, it seems, has never been able to step away from that. And into this conversation, I would add Indian, who are stuck making a replica of a motorcycle that was outdated in 1953, and they're still going on that. Now, that hardly seems a way to build a successful company, in my opinion. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that, on why Harley-Davidson has never just been able to shed, keep that design experience and their history and incorporate into more modern products, because they've always had seemingly these shackles on?
Yeah, I do. It's interesting because it's not just Harley Davidson. It's some of the examples you gave. Um, Harley couldn't do what Ducati's doing directly, just as much as
And why not? And I guess that's the root of my question. Why
yeah.
not?
The reality is that we as consumers have established a sort of brand expectation that ties to somewhat the ethnicity of the bike, and we have different requirements depending on what badge is on it. So, uh, Harley, the example you gave is definitely a challenge, right? Like it's a big, known to be a big American cruiser, right? Like it fits there. It's a certain riding style. Even your description of the V Rod, right? Like it's very very unique, right? And it created its own niche, right? Where it was, there's people who love that bike can't imagine anything other than that, right? It hit really well with that consumer. When I think about like some of these brands, like I've used this in the past where if we were looking in a category of say sport bike or sport touring bike, and you were looking at say European brands, let's just use two to keep the model simple. If I was looking at BMW and I was looking at Ducati, I have two different expectations of those bikes, right? Like you might look at spec sheet and there's some table stakes, right? There's going to be power and feel and delivery, but really like, and I'm just going to generalize this, but it hits the point, is that I have a higher expectation of the engineering of the BMW because of its brand ethnicity. Whereas the Ducati, I expect a certain kind of look and sexiness of it that I don't hold to the BMW as fairly. And they start to differentiate on that, but it's also creating this consumer expectation that you need to deliver on that. And I think that's what you're describing that Harley has this challenge with because there is that certain American expectation of what it is. And when they start to sway a little bit too far out of that, um, the loyalists have a very loud voice and they're like, I hate it. That's great. It's not for you. It's like they're growing the brand into a new customer base. Like it wasn't ever like nobody ever expected you to buy that. We're not asking you to trade your bagger in on a V-Rod. Like
Yeah.
completely different customer. And so I think that's the challenge that they kept kind of tripping over. Um, and I don't blame the people of Harley, right? Like they're not actually doing a bad job. The bikes you've described are, you know, very well spec'd, very well engineered, well executed bikes. I think there's something broader of their commitment to the long term picture of it. And then,
Aha. Now
yeah.
we're getting somewhere. Yeah, I'm sorry I interrupted you, but I think there's something within what you said, which is a commitment to the long term. And um, Harley, from my standpoint, and I've dealt with both the Canadian distributor for a long time, Fred Dealey Imports,
Mhm.
and I've dealt with people in Milwaukee. And it's interesting from my perspective. It's probably the most timid motorcycle brand you deal with, and I say that because like this podcast, I've been trying to get somebody from Harley on for 2 years to talk about the Pan America. And I was told by a PR person that I would have to prepare all my questions in advance. And I wasn't out to skewer anyone. I just wanted to talk about the development of the bike with guys like you.
Yeah.
What bikes did you earmark and what are some of the challenges and how do you incorporate a new kind of motorcycle into an existing motorcycle brand? But Harley, they're very fearful and very timid. And You know, to your point of Harley being a company that makes American heavyweight touring motorcycles, which they do better than anyone. Now, why has that terminology prevented them from sort of modernizing the fleet? Whereas, yes, we expect something sexy from Ducati, but, sexy is a broad interpretation, as should heavyweight American touring be a broad category. So this is what I don't understand about them. Is it, and I think you may have touched on it, which is that have they not just had the stones to make a decision and saying, you know what, we've got to do this and we're going to take a hit, but we're not going to back down. Is there something in that?
Yeah, and now I'm talking as an enthusiast, not just on history, but like let's unpack that a little bit. When we look at the Pan America, I think clearly Harley isn't known for building a single bike platform. Like everything would be that I've already described would always have the intent of having multiple models that outfit, more of bookends of use. And the Pan America, I believe, has or had this opportunity to really connect what the broader brand is known for, right? Being a great American tourer. And if we just get philosophical a little bit, if Harley is going to enter adventure touring as a category, what would that be? And it feels like they hit that. Um, and we'll leave besides details of how it's performing and why aside. But I think what that commitment was hinting on is that, well, what else is there? What else is there in the platform? Because I think that's historically what has propped up kind of this laddering that I write about, where you need some of these elements where you have entry points, where you have ability to create halos, you have ability to create good, better, best, right? Where yeah, I really aspire to have the best, but maybe right now in my life I can only afford the good. You need the product portfolio to reflect that, and now you have this platform that is pretty singular. Like, take it or leave it. This is what it is. And
Yes.
it's interesting that, like, it's been pretty public. Like, they canceled the Bronx model, which was more of like I think a Street Fighter look.
Yes.
Uh,
And just to be clear, based on the Pan America architecture,
Based
correct?
on the same architecture, which is
Yes.
very logical. Like, we could have all predicted that would be something that they would, develop. And I notice, if you pay attention to the custom market, boy, a whole lot of people take Pan Americas and customize them into, Street Fighters.
And into
And
the Bronx.
yeah, and so it's, and again, this is influenced by what's happening in racing, right? Because guys are starting to race these bikes in hooligan class, and
Yeah, yeah.
have they have exposure to things that they wanna do themselves. So it's there, but you're right. How how do they how do they expand that, right? Where are they now?
Well, let me ask you this, from a manufacturing standpoint, um, it would seem to me that it would be necessary to make a profit in a challenging marketplace, which it is now. And you talked about the larger capacity twins, excuse me, and how there was a whole bunch of models based on that one architecture.
Mhm.
If you make as the Pan America is, if you make a single model, is it hard to make that profitable because you've got all that engineering expense, all the R&D, and you only have one singular model to earn that money back?
Yeah, you're onto it. It's
Yeah,
it's it's really the opposite, right? You've got basically, it's the classic, you've got all of your eggs in one basket, right?
right.
It's, um, you're you're relying on that one model to meet your business case. And, I my legacy at Harley-Davidson was, in really this motorcycle program management, right? Where, I'm managing the budgets and the plans and, really the outcomes. And one of my famous lines was, well, now, we finished this plan. Now that we know what's not going to happen, how are we going to like mitigate the risks that are clearly going to present ourselves? And what you're describing is like an immense risk. If I've got it all into one model, like now it has to beat that because I don't have anything else to like add to my business case that is the variability we just know will happen. And we can't ignore the fact that like there's been macroeconomic cycles in the last, decade that clearly influence the way people spend on this type of product. Because it is a discretionary spend, and it's highly dependent on availability of credit. So it has nothing to do with how good the vehicle is sometimes. It's some outside factor that doesn't allow people to actually, commit. Um, so it can be a miss.
It is certainly, I mean, a challenge. I think that the every time I go by a building site and I see a high rise being built, I think, how do you figure out how much everything costs? Because I've renovated in my house, and I just know how quickly that gets out of control.
Yeah.
And then I think of building making a motorcycle and all the stuff and all the R&D and the testing and you try not to have recalls. And of course, you can't just overbuild everything because then it's 1,100 pounds and far too expensive to build. So just before I let you go, just give me a sense of what a challenge it is to build products and almost back circled, to the beginning of our conversation, this sort of this notion of creating desire in new products, but also how do you how do you keep track of every little thing and making a product just good enough? It sounds immensely complicated.
It is, it is. It's interesting, like, even your comment about, like, the cost itself. I have the opposite view. Like, why would I work on anything if I didn't understand what it was gonna cost? Like, why would I put any money towards investing in something if I didn't understand what it was gonna cost? And it's something I talk to our clients about all the time. Like, we have no interest in starting a design program if we don't already have cost targets and we understand the business case.
Right.
Because if you don't understand it at the beginning, it's just gonna be a result at the end, and I can't control it, back to earlier in our conversation. So, I would much rather kill a program early because it's just impossible to meet the business case, and then pick the right program that will. meet what I'm trying to do as a business. Um, and everything else gets easier from there. And I don't mean to simplify it, but like your question of like how do you manage the complexity? It's like how do you eat an elephant, right? It's one bite at a time. It really is that, right? Like it's literally I mean, it is very complex and it's, as you can imagine, spreadsheet after spreadsheet, but it really is about having complete data, but also just putting accountability on the right players in the process to own their part of the data. And then you have a system that just works. And that's how we managed it, was just really putting this emphasis on it's all important and your role is important in this and it does affect this and not waiting till the end to roll it all up, knowing as we're making decisions what the impact of that was, all the way along the way.
Michael, thank you so much for your time today. It's I'm appreciative that you'd made the time to talk to us, and I think we all learned a little bit more than, at least I did, and more than I knew at the beginning. So thank you again for joining me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Well, that's all, folks. Thank you for listening to the Lowdown Radio Show.